Okay. Well, it's 3:30, so I'll let you take it away, Katie.
All right. Welcome to the Geospatial Forum. I am Dr. Katie Martin, and I'm a faculty fellow in the Center for Geospatial Analytics and a faculty member in Forestry and Environmental Resources. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Diego Riveros-Iregui. He is the Bowman and Gordon Gray Distinguished Professor in the Department of Geography at UNC Chapel Hill. And he arrived there on a journey that started with a BS in geosciences from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. And he has a master's of science in geology from the University of Minnesota. Followed that with a PhD in ecology and environmental sciences from Montana State University. After which he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and then an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska before relocating to UNC in 2013. So he's been there since 2013. His research interests include watershed science, forest and soil processes, ecosystem ecology, and human environment interactions, which you might want to ask him about beavers included in that. Currently, his field studies include rural and urban watersheds in the North Carolina Piedmont, high altitude wetlands in the Andes Mountains, and human impacted highlands of the Galapagos Islands. He's the recipient of the J. Carlisle Sitterson Award for teaching first-year students and the National Science Foundation Faculty Early Career Development or Career Award. So with all that, I am fortunate that I met Diego when I started my faculty career here and learned of his biography afterwards. Otherwise, I might have been too intimidated to speak with him. But we are fortunate that he's here to share some of his research on carbon fluxes across terrestrial and aquatic environments in a tropical alpine watershed here with us today.
Thank you, Katie. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep,
and
sounds
you can
good.
See my screen. Okay. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, John, for organizing all around my invitation. Katie, thank you so much for hosting me. It was great talking to you and your students earlier today. And thank you, everyone who's listening, watching this talk. I'm going to talk about a project that we have in South America, in Ecuador. And I'm going to talk about carbon fluxes across terrestrial and aquatic environments. And before I get started, I wanted to show you a photo of our field site. This is a field site that I'm going to be referring to throughout my talk. So this is one of the wetlands that I will be talking about. I'm going to show you some data on carbon fluxes from these wetlands. This is wetland at about 13,700 feet in elevation. This peak that you see here is the Antisana volcano. This other peak that you see back here is Cotopaxi. So it's a very interesting site. It's a beautiful site. The road that you see here is actually the highway that goes from Quito to the Amazon. So this goes west, east. We're looking south here. And I'm going to tell you something about the work that we're doing. It's a series of alpine wetlands connected by narrow streams. But I'm going to start with the most important slide that you will see today, and this is the acknowledgements. Kriti Whitmore is a PhD student on this project, so I'm presenting a lot of her work and her data. She just got back from Ecuador. Second field season about a month ago. Andrew Murray is also a PhD student in my lab. He's been to Ecuador with us, and my three excellent collaborators down at the University of San Francisco de Quito, Andrea Encalada, Esteban Suarez, and Gonzalo Rivas Torres. It's a great team. We are working with an amazing team of undergrads from UNC. They participate in this international research experience for undergrads. So far, we've had 7 fantastic undergraduate students who've gone to Ecuador, conducted field work. They've come back, written manuscripts, and some of them are getting published. And it's really exciting to work with students that are just so motivated. The staff at USFQ, at our partner university, have been outstanding, and the government of Ecuador has given us access to the sites, especially this year during the pandemic. And funding comes from the National Science Foundation. Okay, so I wanted to start by showing you this slide. And for several years now, we've known that emissions of CO2 from inland waters are very high. In fact, they're in the same order of uptake of CO2 by oceans, so very large fluxes. But what has been revealed very recently, and this is really just in the last 2 or 3 years, is that CO2 emissions, CO2 evasion from mountains and high elevation mountains is particularly high. So there's a paper that was published in Nature Communications that conducts some modeling across all the world's high mountain ranges, and estimate evasion of CO2 is very high, despite that streams from these mountains are actually very small. They occupy small spatial coverage. And the streams don't necessarily have high dissolved CO2. They actually have low CO2, but they have high gas exchange velocities. And this is simply because they're steep terrain. So there's high turbulence in these waters. And what's also being revealed from this work is the role of groundwater in delivering CO2 to streams. And this has been, is particularly true in places like the Alps, with groundwater delivery to streams, groundwater that has been in contact with rock that perhaps has not been too weathered and is carrying a lot of carbon into streams, and that's one source of that CO2, and that CO2 is emitted rapidly into the atmosphere. So there are a couple of more studies that have looked into this and have highlighted this role of groundwater, and essentially they've summarized that it is just really complex, right? Because groundwater surface water interactions, especially in complex terrain, are just difficult to characterize. And we have this diagram that comes from this Nature Geoscience paper by Clement Duvert and colleagues that shows the stream, a mountain stream affected by the geomorphology, affected by various and heterogeneous groundwater inputs. And the dissolved CO2 dynamics change because of those interactions with the groundwater. So what we know is that we need mechanistic models that account for this complexity in the landscape and that account for topography. So our work is trying to get at that variability that we see in the landscape. What I'm going to present here really is preliminary work, preliminary findings of an ongoing project that we're carrying out in Ecuador. And the other aspect, especially relevant in high elevation mountains, is atmospheric pressure. So from earlier work by Madsen and Likens, we know that atmospheric pressure plays an important role in controlling emissions of methane, evolution of methane. And this was seen, this was observed, changes of 2 or 3% in atmospheric pressure would have important changes in the amount of methane that was emitted to the atmosphere. And a more recent paper in Nature Geoscience looked at evolution of methane across different streams, and they also saw an interesting relationship between atmospheric pressure and methane evolution. That at greater pressure, sorry, that at lower pressure, there was greater emissions of methane. The same authors show an important control on the diffusivity. At least this was seen for the stream order and the diffusivity of methane and evolution of methane. It was not observed for the fluxes of CO2, at least for stream order, but we're going to try to get to this here in this talk. So take home from these studies, low air pressure was associated with greater methane flux, including ebullition. Ebullition and diffusion are both negatively correlated with stream order. And I guess the greater point here is that there are disproportionately large emissions from high elevation streams. In this case, methane, in the previous case, CO2, both greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So with this background, I'm going to focus now on our area of study, which is the Northern Andes of Ecuador and Colombia. This diagram at the bottom shows us the Amazon basin, shows us the Andes, and here we have a profile of the Andes that are receiving all this moisture that is generated over the Amazon, carried by trade winds, forced up over the Andes, and precipitated right at the top of the Andes. So both field sites that I'll show you are right here, right on the continental divide of the Andes. And all these conditions with lots of moisture, high solar radiation, because this is the equator, and give rise to an ecosystem called the Paramo, which is known for its high biodiversity, high endemism, and lots of carbon content in this system, and really good water quality. So there are a lot of interactions between the type of vegetation, the quality of the soils, and land cover, and the quality of the water that runs from the páramos. So you see all these vegetation, these mosses that I show here in this picture really look like a painting, or this plant that is endemic to Colombia called Spaletia, and that has adapted to moisture, to capturing moisture from fog. And the water quality really is very good. Soils are very thick. There's a lot of volcanism in the region, and geologically, these systems have been isolated. So here are some characteristics of Paramo. They're extremely rich in carbon. So some of the highest stocks of carbon per unit area on the planet. So actually comparable to very northern latitudes like permafrost environments. High rates of asphyxiation, and they are considered the leading edge of climate change in the tropics. So here are some characteristics of them. So low atmospheric pressure, high elevation. There are very large fluctuations in temperature throughout the day. High UV radiation, they also high winds at that elevation. Growing season occurs year round. They've been isolated through the geologic record, as I mentioned. History of volcanism that generates this very rich soil. So volcanic material binds really well with organic matter to generate this very good soils. And of course, the topography, complex terrain, and the amount of water they receive. But they're also threatened. They're threatened by land use change because they have good soils. And this is a picture of a Paramo in Colombia, and a false color image of the same place. And you see this image highlights areas of high photosynthetic activity. So this right here is a reservoir that is at about 3,000 meters in elevation, and everything here is above that reservoir, right? So that reservoir is collecting water for drinking water. So all this agriculture really takes place above at really high elevations, often above the tree line. And there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure to the farmers to increase production. One of the things that always really kills me about thinking of this environment is that potatoes is a crop that the locals typically grow there. But potatoes are actually a very cheap crop there, and farmers are usually struggling to make ends meet because of the price of potatoes. So this would be a great opportunity, a great study for something like payment for ecosystem services or something like that. We look at the role of this disturbance in hydrology. So one of the major challenges in understanding this disturbance is understanding sort of like the dynamics of both the hydrology and the soil physics. So the most prevalent soils in the Paramos are endosols. So under undisturbed conditions, under natural conditions, these soils have very low bulk density, they have high infiltration capacity, and they have pretty good structural stability. But upon disturbance, these soils exhibit what's known as excessive erosive behavior. So it's characterized by a very high sediment load, and materials that are hydrophobic, aggregates are hydrophobic, that contain a lot of organic matter. So we have a diagram here. During the wet season, we just see an excessive export of sediment. So we know this happens with endosols. What we don't know is how these erosive materials stimulate the transformation of nutrients in the streams or in wetlands at these high elevations, at these really low temperatures. So, and what implications these transformation of nutrient has for the water quality downstream. And I should say that there are very large cities that have historically been located along the edge of the Andes precisely because of the good water quality in these areas. So 3 years ago or so, with Tim Covino and Ricardo Gonzalez Pinzon, we had a briefing in HP in which we essentially counted the number of studies using keywords like stream and nutrient, and this is across North America, Europe, South America or Latin America, and South/Latin America, but in high elevations. So what we see that the number of studies is actually very, very low at high elevations. And when we use a key term like stream metabolism, the difference is even more pronounced, with the total of studies being very, very large with respect to what is available for South America and Latin America. So all this to say that we actually know very little about these systems and how they behave, and this drives some of the research questions that we ask through our research. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to answer all these questions. These are the guiding questions of our current research in the Paramo. So are these watersheds important contributors to the atmosphere of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, right? So namely CO2 and methane. What are the mechanisms that drive the variability of terrestrial and aquatic CO2 fluxes? And I'm going to get a little bit into this today. And a question that we're just starting to address is this: what is the relationship among land cover, nutrient loading, and stream metabolism? So we're just starting to look at stream metabolism, how it changes, what are its drivers, and so on. And about 2 years ago, there was a paper that came out in Ag and Forest Med. I believe this is the first flux, the first paper based on flux tower data from the Northern Andes. And this is by a group at University of Cuenca. Galo Carrillo is the lead author. So what's interesting about this paper is that they looked at NEE GPP for 2 years. And what they found was that consistent, so respiration here is in the red and uptake is in the greens, and consistently month after month, it appeared as if these Paramo watersheds are acting as a carbon source. And of course, this is very interesting. There's a lot of news around this, but this can also be problematic because given the amount of carbon that is stored in these high elevation systems, this may be first evidence of the effects of climate change in the region. So this is certainly to be followed upon. And this is significant because the carbon content of páramos for Ecuador, they cover 1% of the total area, but páramos contain about 23% of the total above and below ground carbon stocks of the country of Ecuador, according to this study. So some very interesting numbers, some really interesting dynamics that are taking place right now in the systems. We looked at total carbon in soils of different land use. This includes páramo, soils covered with páramo vegetation, or covered with grass that were tilled, or covered with grass and potato crops. And what we saw was that, yes, as you go up with different land uses, there's an effect. There's a decrease of the amount of carbon in the soil. And that also decreases with depth. So this was for a Paramo in Colombia, published in a Colombian journal. So we started to look at the role of wetlands and streams in transforming this carbon, because presumably all this carbon is being exported, or most of this carbon is being exported through the stream network. So we instrumented a transition of wetland to stream located in Chingaza National Park. This is a national park just east of Bogota, really close to the capital of Colombia. And what we did was we installed sensors that measure dissolved CO2. And we installed these sensors at the outlet of this little wetland and 250 meters downstream from the wetland. And what I'm going to show you is about 5 days of data that shows dynamics of dissolved CO2 at the outlet of the wetland here in gray, and 250 meters downstream from the outlet. What was interesting about this was that the dynamics were completely decoupled. And this is dissolved CO2 in the same stream, only 250 meters apart, 2 points apart from one another. So the dynamics appear to be strongly dominated by productivity in the wetlands. So you can actually see this is sunrise taking place, sunset taking place. So the gray dots here show a decrease during sunrise, but there's actually something else happening in the stream. So also note that at both locations, water is super saturated with CO2 with respect to the atmosphere. If we look at the upstream site in relation to the downstream site, we see this emergent hysteresis between the dissolved CO2 at both sites. And we hypothesize here that this hysteresis is a function of essentially how much water is in the stream, and that during wet times of the year, and as well as when travel times become shorter, this system may be functioning more like in sync. So this hysteresis may disappear. But of course, we only have 5 days of data here. What was also interesting about the system was we injected what's known as a smart tracer to look at stream metabolism rates. And this is smart tracer that my colleague Ricardo Gonzalez Pinzon published extensively about. So it's per tracers, risazarine and risarufin, which are parent-daughter tracers. So risazarine is blue and transforms irreversibly to this red tracer, risarufin, under aerobic metabolism. And we did this injection, one at the wetland outlet, and looking at the product that we would recover 250 meters downstream and 500 meters downstream. So we saw some transformation of the tracer, but most of the tracer was recovered, at least for the first recovery point. But we injected this tracer also at the inlet of the wetland. So we injected these tracers through the wetland. And what we saw here was essentially higher biological transformation of this tracer through the wetland. And that makes sense. There's longer travel times, so more opportunity for biological activity. But what we believe here is that this simple analysis has the potential to represent a range of transformation dynamics and potentials of these alpine tropical ecosystems, where we know the hydrology is changing. So some of the main conclusions from this study was that we saw clear differences in transport between wetlands and streams that were driving clear differences in the biology. But it also highlighted this special focus on the transitions from wetlands to streams to perhaps wetlands again. And that is much of what drives our current research approach. So in Ecuador, we're looking at this transitions, and we're examining wetlands as wetlands and terrestrial transitions at these environments that are divided into 3 or can be classified into 3. So completely saturated environments, an environment that is oscillating. So sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's dry. So these wetlands expand and shrink with the hydrology, with the seasonality. And also you see changes in water table. And we're establishing transects that allow us to sample across these different environments. Okay, so that's what's driving our work in Ecuador. We started working in this wetland and the transition of this wetland to the stream. This is what the stream looks like. Very deep soils and very steep. So you actually see just a very straight stream. We were lucky that a paper led by 3 undergraduate students was highlighted in the cover of JGR Biogeosciences in the month of August last year. I was very fortunate to work with this group. And this is a picture of a restaurant we were at in Ecuador, and some of the students tell me, hey, Diego, look, we're the experts of carbon, because we have been studying carbon in this environment. So yeah, thanks to these undergrads for their work. And I'm going to show you some of the results now. So looking across this transition, we established a series of synoptic campaigns, sampling campaigns, where we sampled dissolved CO2, the top panel, and evasion of CO2 from the water surface and the bottom panel. This dashed line that you see here at about 100 meters is actually a 4-meter waterfall that occurs in this stream. It's actually like somewhere around here. You don't see it in the photograph, but it's there. And we're starting sampling at the bottom of the stream and went upstream, collecting both dissolved CO2, PCO2 measurements, and evasion measurements. And something interesting that we saw was that the dissolved CO2 is highest at the outlet of the peatland and starts decreasing rapidly. And right at the waterfall, dissolved CO2 gets to its lowest, right? We did this synaptics, we conducted the synaptics in different days. So also something else that was interesting was that we saw an inverse relationship with discharge. So those days with the highest discharge had the lowest dissolved CO2 and vice versa. And this was especially true for those points above the waterfall. When we look at what was actually coming out of the top of the water. So this is by using a flotation device and putting it right over the water and collecting CO2 from the water surface. We saw a somewhat similar pattern. It's not as neatly organized as we see it with the dissolved CO2, but of course there are a lot of other variables that also play a role here, including turbidity, including like channel morphology, and so on. But some really interesting things that we found here that we learned from this experiment, for example, 80% of CO2 was evaded to the atmosphere in the first 150 meters of the stream channel. The transition from transport limited to supply limited system occurs above and below this waterfall. So the waterfall seems to mark that point. And also some interesting dynamics in that hydrology appears to mediate the magnitude of the dissolved CO2, but geomorphology appears to control the spatial patterns that we saw. When we compared this fluxes from the stream, so again, from the top of the water, with what was coming from the top of the soil, and these are collars that are installed in dry soil immediately adjacent to the stream channel, we saw that aquatic fluxes are up to sometimes even an order of magnitude greater than terrestrial fluxes. And again, these plots are directly adjacent to the channel. So some really interesting dynamics, big differences in the fluxes per unit area in these environments that are just adjacent to one another. So we look at the four different environments that I mentioned. So one, the peatland outlet sees most of the CO2 flux per unit area. That CO2 decreases downstream. This is the CO2 from the unsaturated terrestrial environment. And this comes from that oscillating environment. So that environment that is clear, that sometimes is inundated, sometimes is not. And we also see different dynamics in the diel CO2 from both environments. This is peatland outlet, and this is the oscillating environment. This moment, this was oscillating, flooded environment. So very interesting dynamics, very different dynamics in a very small spatial area. So if we look at continuous data, the previous slides referred to snapshots in time, but we also had sensors that were measuring these fluxes continuously. I want to highlight these sensors here from this bottom panel. There are actually 4 stations, sensors measuring dissolved CO2 every 15 minutes. And we see essentially 2 things. One is the pronounced diel variability that occurs there. And the second is that there's a strong response to hydrologic events like this, storms that occur here and here seem to have an effect, an important effect on the magnitude of these fluxes. For the last station, this is a last station downstream from the waterfall, dynamics are completely different. So the first stations are very similar to one another. The last station is somewhat different. So this data collected in 2019. And this year we were fortunate to visit this site again. So we extended our measurements way beyond the waterfall, and we're starting to see some interesting dynamics, CO2 picking up again. And we're thinking about groundwater sources or just simply other tributaries, small tributaries that are coming into the stream with lots of CO2. We're also investigating the gas transfer velocity, essentially how easily gas is transferred from the water. And we're doing this using two different methods. The first method is a method that we call kinematic method to estimate this gas transfer velocity, or K, that is dependent on the geometry of the stream. So this is the slope, this is depth, and this is the velocity. And it's an empirical relationship that gives us one estimate of this gas transfer velocity over time. And that's what we see here with this triangle. The second method, we can actually estimate gas transfer velocities continuously using or solving K in this equation, because we're measuring the fluxes with the flotation device. We're also measuring the CO2 dissolved in the water with a sensor that is submerged in water. We are actually assuming this parameter, and we are estimating Henry's constant. But what we see is that both methods compare well, except at low flow. There appears to be a strong relationship between gas transfer velocity and discharge. And other studies have also shown that this gas transfer velocity and these relationships are site specific, and they're dependent on geomorphology. So a lot of variability. We have two promising methods, and the advantage of two methods is that we can compare numbers against one another. When we look at our estimates of gas transfer velocity and in relation to other studies, we see that our study, which are these yellow symbols here, are somewhat, our measurements are somewhat in the ballpark of what has been reported from other environments, including mountain environments. But what we're seeing perhaps is higher velocities, right? So higher water velocities. So what might be one of the reasons why we're seeing this, this high gas transfer velocities. And the continuous data also allow us to look at the diel patterns, evaluate the dynamics of these variables over time. So here I'm showing you diel patterns for 4 variables. And these are essentially, you can think of them as histograms of the daily maxima and daily minima for each of these variables, for including gas transfer velocity, dissolved CO2, evasion of CO2 from the water surface, and discharge. So some interesting things that we're seeing, evasion of CO2 and dissolved CO2, the maximum of those two occur at sunrise. The minima of those two variables occur in the afternoon. And we're seeing that evasion of CO2 is greater at night. And this is also related, actually this site is one of the sites included in this recent paper by Gomez-Jenner et al. In Nature Geoscience that points out to this interesting phenomenon. And we're using our measurements of dissolved oxygen, and we're using stream metabolizer to get an estimate of metabolism in the stream and seeing how much metabolism may contribute to evasion. Some of our initial measurements suggest that in-stream respiration, so this is transformation of carbon that occurs in the stream, may contribute between 30 to 90% of CO2 that is eventually evaded. Global estimates, according to Hodgkins et al., are about 28%. So we're somewhere in the ballpark, although we see a lot of dynamics, and these are all appear to be driven by precipitation events. Okay, and getting pretty close to the end here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the future work, which is also the work that we just conducted in the last 2 months in Ecuador. So we essentially want to map the stream network of this watershed, and we want to target a lot of different wetland stream transitions, a lot of places with waterfalls, channels, and interesting geomorphologic features. We have had the fortune to work with a really excellent team that includes students from both UNC and students and researchers from USFQ in Quito. I have this picture of two recent graduates from UNC, Liz Farquhar and Tessa Davis, and they worked on this device. So this is our flux chamber. And Liz had the idea of tying this flux chamber to this bamboo cane, and everything goes in a backpack. So the battery, the computer goes in the backpack, and all they were doing was hiking around these different streams. Some streams were big, some were really tiny trickles of water, measuring the flux of CO2 coming out of them. We see very large spatial variability, and we couple this with dissolved CO2, which is this sensor that you see right there, with water samples for the DOC content. And in occasions, we put this scan that allows us to, along with the water samples, allows us to look at DOC in this area. So we're really curious to see what we're gonna find out. But so far, we already see interesting patterns. We see areas along stream. This is about a kilometer stream reach. Here's the elevation changes, and we see changes along the stream, and some changes may be explained by the geomorphology, but other changes are not. So the interesting thing here is that we're mapping all the stream network, as I mentioned, big channels, but also those tiny tributaries that we're actually seeing carry a lot of CO2 into the stream. Okay, so on to some conclusions. We observed that dissolved CO2 from the Paramo peatland was carried into the stream reach, where over 80% of it was evaded to the atmosphere within the first 150 meters of the stream channel. But we also saw that in-stream metabolism, CO2 that is generated in the stream, is very important. We are seeing or confirming that headwater tropical streams contribute disproportionately greater amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere. Comparing our numbers to numbers published in the literature, we're seeing that these fluxes that we're measuring are greater than fluxes of CO2 from lower positions in the stream network, even in the Amazon, even like deep in the Amazon. The numbers that we're seeing at the very top of the Amazon basin are greater. And also greater than terrestrial environments just adjacent to the streams. So the connectivity, the hydrologic connectivity between wetlands and streams plays an important role in regulating these fluxes to the atmosphere and in regulating the cycling of nutrients in the stream channel. And again, this idea of hydrology determining the magnitude of the fluxes, geomorphology determining the spatial patterns of the fluxes. So we are hopefully, and depending on how the pandemic continues between now and December and January, but we want to go in December and January when it's the dry season, and these connections are stopped. Wetlands hang on to the water, and the streams go dry in the dry season, and we're gonna evaluate these fluxes. That's our hope, at least. And our findings represent a first step in understanding carbon cycling at the interface of terrestrial aquatic ecosystems in tropical alpine catchments. And I'm just going to say thank you for attending this seminar. Here are some of the students that participated in the field work. Some of the students conducting outreach with K through 12 students at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham. And oh my God, look at this, people at a scientific meeting, AGU 2019. All right, and with that, I will take questions.
All right, any questions? You can unmute or you can type in the chat and I'll read your question out, whichever you prefer. All right, I have a question in the chat that I'll read out. Was any of the data collected thus far collected during a particular phase of ENSO? Is there a desire to explore effects of flashy changes to precipitation regimes due to ENSO cycle changes?
That's a really good question. Rodney, good to hear from you, a former student of mine in the audience. So the first field season took place in 2019. Well, I guess to get to the bottom line here, our measurements, as you saw from some of the slides, cover only about 6-7 weeks. The 2019 season was very rainy. We actually get most of the moisture from the Amazon. We receive a lot of rain in 2019. And the dynamics that we see there reflect those hydrologic conditions then. This year was actually different. When we arrived there, it was still June or so. It was still the dry season. The rain was just starting. So I'll be really curious to see what happens. The truth is that we haven't completed the data analysis for this year, but I'll be really curious to see differences in the data we collected in 2019 with a lot of rain versus the data we're collecting now.
All right. Excellent. Okay, we have a question from Douglas.
Hello, yeah, that was a really good presentation. I enjoyed it. And I was just wondering if you could, I don't know, the idea of taking undergraduates international is really cool. I was wondering if you could further, I don't know, give some sort of tips or hints of like, you know, your experiences with that. Was this like a formal class or was this just like undergrads in the lab? What was this all about?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yes, it was a really good experience for me. This is part of the broader impacts of this work. And the students applied to participate in this, we call it International REU, so IREU. And students were selected based on their background. And they were paid to conduct the fieldwork, but when they came, they participated in a year-long professional development program that essentially involves 2 courses that they take with me, and they conduct the data analysis of the same measurements they collected. So it was a very good experience for me to see how these students went from essentially knowing very little to nothing about carbon fluxes or hydrology for that matter, to learning how to use and program sensors and install sensors and troubleshoot and all that, to collecting the data, archiving it, to all the way to analyzing the data and making figures and start asking questions about the data that they've collected. So this cohort that you see, yeah, most of them in this picture are from the first cohort. The second cohort was affected by COVID, unfortunately. So it was sort of like split into two groups. A group that eventually went to Ecuador did this after they graduated. So we didn't have the same chance to conduct the data analysis afterward. But they were just fantastic in the field. They were very resourceful. In fact, let me go back if I can. If I figure out how. Oh, there you go. This design is a design that we're going to be using into the future, and it was like all Liz's idea. Just put it everything in a backpack and hike. It's it's really rugged terrain, and it's really high, so you're always tired. There's low oxygen, and so the cane was actually pretty helpful to hike, to support yourself. And then we would go, and it was also light because it's just bamboo, so it's very light. And you would go to a place, you would install the sensor, you lower the sensor right so that there's a good seal between the collar of the chamber and the surface of the water. Another undergrad came up with this idea of drilling into the collar. There's an Nalgene tube in here. I don't know if you can see it. And there's a stopcock at the bottom. So not only are we measuring the CO2 that is being emitted from the surface, we're actually collecting headspace from the chamber. We're using the chamber to circulate the air. And we're, we injected this gas into an isotope analyzer to look at what kind of isotopes this samples have. We're now going to send these samples to lab to look at methane. Methane is another variable that we're very interested in. We've done like very little. We've done nothing on methane. So it has been a very good experience working with undergraduate students.
Excellent. The next question in the chat is from Marcelo. And he says, great talk. Have you considered photo bleaching or geothermal inputs as extra sources of CO2?
No, we have not, Marcelo. And I would love to talk to you more about this. So far, we are looking at, well, I mean, UV is so high that you're probably right. That's probably a very important source there. But so far, we've just looked at what is dissolved and where it is and where it's going, essentially. And we haven't looked much into the sources. But excellent question.
All right. The next question, Marcelo says, once again, great talk. So the next question is from Brad Taylor. He says he misses the Paramo and he enjoyed your talk. And he was wondering if you were to generalize, how would these findings be similar or different to US Rocky Mountain alpine streams?
So thank you, Brad, for that question. I'd love to hear about your experiences in the Paramo. So I guess the main difference with a place like the Rocky Mountains, there's a paper that just came out by, what's his name? Rob Striegel, USGS. There's a group of folks from USGS in Boulder and Denver that just published a paper with some synaptic measurements of both dissolved CO2 and CO2 emitted from streams up in the Rocky Mountains. The main difference is the amount of carbon that is stored in these soils, right? So we're talking about, as you, I'm sure you remember, soils that are very, very deep, that can be in places 2 or 3 meters deep of very dark soil, a lot of organic carbon in the soil, whereas like in the Rocky Mountains, soil cover is going to be very, very thin. So that's essentially the main reason, the main difference. I forgot your other question. I guess slope, aspect, season, and clouds. Okay, so the seasonality, how the seasonality affected that. So slope appears to be a very important parameter because it affects velocity. So we're looking right now, we're essentially in the mapping stage. We want to find variable or the set of variables that will allow us to take these measurements and scale them up to larger regions across the Paramo with these type of soils and with these type of environmental conditions. So we're looking into all those biophysical variables and seeing which of those will allow us to do the type of upscaling that we want to do from this stream network.
Excellent. Okay. We also have a question about if we understand carbon emissions from aquatic systems, does that lend any insight for managing carbon? Is it different from carbon produced by industry that we can track or potentially achieve net zero? Would it be harder to manage carbon in a natural process? So this question comes from Jen.
So I guess the bottom line is that if we understand how much carbon is being emitted from these streams, we can do a calculation with regards to like how long are these systems going to remain, or how long are they're going to hold on to these carbon stocks. So if you remember one of the slides that I show with the flux tower measurements. So these systems have been working as carbon sinks for hundreds, thousands of years, perhaps, right? Otherwise, they would not have that amount of carbon. But the fact that right now is a time when we're able to conduct these measurements and our data sets are very, very short. But right now we're seeing that the systems are emitting a lot of carbon. In some places they're acting as carbon sources. So that is something to be worried about with regards to the amount of carbon that is stored there, with regards to the fate of these systems in a warmer world.
All right. Roderick has another question. Does the spatial extent of the Paramo appear to be changing across time, years and decades? Due to their links to below ground carbon, I'm wondering if they could represent a greenhouse gas positive feedback loop if they're expanded.
Let's see. So we know that some of our sites, for example, are very young. Some soils are very young. So as you move higher elevation, so I guess the bottom line is, yes, we know that geologically, this ecosystems have expanded or contracted, right? Some of our sites, the highest sites, actually have very, very thin soils. And you can see the mineral soils, you can see the remnants of glaciers. So perhaps there was a time where as glaciers retreated, some systems were, vegetation was growing at lower elevations, and those sites at higher elevations remain covered in ice. So our very highest site, it's actually really difficult to access, and it's always covered in fog. But you see the soils are very thin, so nothing like the 2 or 3 meters that I mentioned for some of the sites, like the site you see here in the photo. So that is just a result of these sites being free of glaciers just for much shorter periods of times. If you're referring to these systems changing in response to an anthropogenic forcing. That I don't know, and I don't think that we have a record that will allow us to answer that question with any degree of certainty, given our records just don't go far too long.
Okay, well, Diego, thank you very much. And Katie, thank you for hosting. As we end the meeting, I just want to mention that there is a post-forum social for those interested and able, starting at 5:15 p.m. at Morgan Street Food Hall. I just posted that in the chat. I posted it to everybody, but looks like maybe I did not. Try that again. Okay, there's the address. Starts at 5:15. If you're able and interested, hope you can make it. And again, Diego, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Katie. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.